The dominion of mankind, an empire comprised of tens of billions of worlds spread across an uncaring galaxy, where countless souls spend their short existence toiling in smoke-wreathed factories, turning the cogs of its endless war machine. For 1,000 generations it has stood, yet the question hangs in the balance, shall it stand for 1,000 more? Here we stand at the feet of the Great Realm. The Great Realm is the single largest political entity to exist in the known history of Avraxis, being comprised of all the various species of humanity. If you have already seen my video about the history of Avraxis, then we'll be covering some familiar ground here. The Great Realm was formed at the end of the Age of Conquest as a way to unite humanity after some large-scale war that took place. The Great Realm heavily censors what this conflict actually was. The Great Realm as a political entity was developed to be a unifying factor for humanity, primarily a way to protect itself from outside forces, and its existence was first devised by the first Emperor Alvasta. Alvasta designed the Great Realm to be an all-encompassing state, where its government is very much federalized. Solar systems will have their own governors, or sometimes planets, and then those are split up into sub-regions, and then those into regions, and each have their own leadership and government all along the way, and they are usually controlled by aristocratic family houses, and it goes up right up until you get to the central imperial government. The central government is often known as the Imperial Commission, but we'll get onto them later. And above the Imperial Commission you have the Central Committee and then the Emperor himself. The Great Realm was designed to run as efficiently as a galactic-wide regime can possibly run, and that is really by allowing each individual region to govern itself. The reason for this is simply the size and scale of the Great Realm. There is approximately 150 to 300 billion worlds in the galaxy of Avraxis. Many worlds are just missing or undiscovered, and sometimes if worlds are left uncontacted for long enough, they may go missing on their own. And then you get into star clusters and how confusing it can actually be to pick out all the systems and worlds there. Ask an astronomer how difficult it is to count up the number of worlds and you'll understand. It's like trying to count the grains of sand on a beach. This is why even the Great Realm just kinda doesn't know how many worlds it has, and as a result it can only estimate how big it is, where the estimations usually range from around 50 to 80 billion worlds. However, there are approximately 10 to 30 billion dominions, which means factoring in its dominions that would be about 60 to 110 billion, meaning that the Great Realm may control anywhere between 2/3 to 1/3 of the galaxy. There is just no actual way of knowing. There are also the satellite galaxies around Avraxis, Synak, Assidia and Voral. At least these are the three major ones. There are still 40 other satellite galaxies, but those three control around 30 billion between them. So how does an empire that big actually operate? Well, it's confusing. There are four main categories of governance within the Great Realm. The first of these are the core worlds. These are areas of the Great Realm that are under the direct control of the central government. These will usually be Janus and its surrounding systems. Janus being the capital world of which the Great Realm is governed from and which the Emperor lives. The core worlds tend to be the wealthiest planets in the Great Realm, and is where the regime is most powerful. After that, the vast majority of the Great Realm is made up of subject regions. These are the regions of the Great Realm that have their own subdivision governments, and where the Great Realm's federalization really takes hold, as different regional subjects will be allowed to make up their own laws or govern themselves how they wish. However, they are still heavily restricted, as they aren't allowed to do whatever they want. They do still have to submit to the Great Realm's whims, and in turn serve its needs. Their governments are primarily made up of regency houses, where different families act as an aristocratic class that rule over the lower classes of people, and I refer to them as regencies. As well, they act more like regents or governors. While many of them do have the power to govern for themselves, the power of their governance starts and stops at the Emperor. And so while different regions in the Great Realm may operate differently, the methods by which they do things are different, ultimately the goal in which they're trying to achieve is all the same. They must still conform to ideological loyalty to the Great Realm. The next level of governance in the Great Realm are the Dominion. The Dominions are still classed as part of the Great Realm, but they're more like countries within countries, where they get to properly form their own laws, government and military. Many of these Dominions have their own long-standing royal families, and the central government doesn't usually mess with their affairs all that much. Though Dominions are used more like buffer states, shields against outside forces. The point of giving them their own governments and their own militaries is to allow them to respond quicker to threats. It adds an angle of flexibility that otherwise wouldn't have been possible. As a result, the Dominions tend to be where most of the Great Realm's conflicts take place. And then after this you have the Tributary States. Now Tributary States are governments outside of the Great Realm that side with it for beneficial reasons. Tributary states can effectively do whatever they want. They choose to align themselves with the Great Realm, as that's probably what is most beneficial. Most tributary states exist in a position where it's more so they can't actually be absorbed into the Great Realm because they may be too far from its borders. These planetary systems usually align with the Great Realm as they tend to be human systems outside of its territory. That usually requires some form of aid and military assistance. And they're known as tributary states, as well they pay tribute to the Great Realm in some form in order to gain its allegiance. This will usually mean allowing the Great Realm some form of, let's say, access to its natural resources, or even allowing it to use it as a foothold in order to expand its military influence. That is a very basic rundown of the Great Realm's political structure. But what about its military structure? Emperor Alvasta split up the structure of the Great Realm's military to remove it from being a single monolith. Rather, it's very many different institutions that all fight for the Great Realm. And they will usually fight for some aspect. For example, the secret police, the ISA, have a military wing known as the ASD. They will usually act as escorts for imperial governors, but aside from being bodyguards, the ASD can also enact war, let's say usually upon regional governors who the Great Realm wants to remove and replace. You then have system defense forces, which are usually under the control of a regional government, and they will act as a quick response force to any threat, but they tend to also act as civil enforcement, the Great Realm's galactic police. And while you don't necessarily have a standing Imperial army, there is the Solar Tempests. There are hundreds of thousands of Solar Tempest legions, and a legion will operate in a different area of the galaxy. Many of them even travel around. They aren't a centralised force, each with their own military generals and leaderships, but their purpose is to be used as assault forces when called upon. And the next and most expansive military force in all of the Great Realm is of course the Imperial Navy. The Imperial Navy is usually linked to different regions but aren't directly controlled by its government. Just like the Solar Tempests, they act as their own sort of municipality. The Imperial Navy is large and necessarily so, and with each different region having its own fleet, and with other various fleets for other purposes, it allows it to run more efficiently. Fleets of the Imperial Navy don't necessarily have to act with approval from the central government, though they usually must act in cooperation with the regional government as to avoid the sticky political landscape of Avraxis. If an Imperial Navy fleet acts out of line, then you can either use other Imperial Navy fleets, the Solar Tempests, or the Armed Security Detachment to destroy it. And this is ultimately why the Great Realm's military is so decentralised. If one branch of the military is not acting as the Great Realm would like it to, then it can easily be destroyed without harming any other aspects of the military. The problem, however, is that this does cause a lot of internal conflicts and rivalries, which the ISA will usually mediate. And by mediate, I mean put a bullet through someone's head. The Great Realm is an ancient empire, however, the actual number of how long it's been around is up for debate. Official government sources claim the Great Realm has existed for 10,000 years, however nobody knows what the true number actually is. Some sources claim it's been longer and around 15,000 years, while others claim it has actually only been around for 3,000. Of course, how much you trust the regime depends on how much you value your life. Though whatever the real number, it's certainly been around for a long time, and a regime that's been around for so long certainly isn't going to face no issues during its reign. Various regions and dominions across the Great Realm will always face their own minor problems that, on the face of the entire Great Realm, don't even really matter. Throughout pretty much the entire Great Realm's history, it's always been at war with both itself and outsiders. Though this is never too much of an issue for the Great Realm itself, so long as the central government is able to mediate. After Alvasta died, his descendants would become the Prince Regents, the custodians of the Great Realm. Of course, the Prince Regent would be the head of the Drakal family. Alvasta would keep the title of Emperor even in death, as this was more of a symbolic thing of him being the founder of the nation, though it was not inscribed in law that his children could not become Emperor. Some of them did, though it was required that you perform some great feat of heroism in order to become the Emperor, which is where we get on to Emperor Costanza. Costanza was of course one of the many descendants of Alvasta. We'll need to get a bit of a grasp for the era Costanza grew up in. The Great Realm was in a bit of a downward spiral at the time. It had many enemies from all sides and was effectively eating itself from within. To explain, its aristocracy had become inefficient and lazy, simply complacent in allowing the Great Realm to run itself, which for all intents and purposes it is designed to do. But the custodianship was lost. The Drakal family and the rest of the aristocracy were not entirely upholding their duties to the Great Realm, becoming complacent in petty conflicts and internal power struggles, and this lack of a unified idea would allow external and internal enemies to take hold. Of course, this was a gradual decline. It did not simply happen overnight, it happened over several hundreds of years. The first thing to occur is breakaway stage. Regions and dominions may try to break away from the Great Realm. While not completely in name, they would test their boundaries, and many eventually would become autonomous states. However, many would be forced to, as alien empires would begin breaking away and carving up sections of the Great Realm's borders, though an extremely complicated era in the Great Realm's politics. This aside, it was Costanza who would bring a new era of stability to the Great Realm. This would be known as the Costanzarite era. At first, Costanza would lead military campaigns against his own brother, and then kill his father, as this was to secure the throne, since Costanza wasn't actually the heir to the throne and become the Prince Regent. That would be his brother Avisus. Though Costanza could see the way the Great Realm was running, that he understands the Great Realm is a necessary tool to protect humanity, but it can also just as easily be used to destroy it. After he secured the throne, Costanza would later lead military campaigns all along the edges of the Great Realm and the fringes of the galaxy in order to retake a lot of lost territory. Costanza would then use this to claim the title of Emperor and begin heavily reorganizing the regime. The Costanzarite era would be in full swing. Of course, I won't get too deep into this, as what Costanza actually did, his life story, what the reforms he actually made, will all be in Costanza's biography. The Costanzarite era would have such a profound impact on the Great Realm that he's still worshipped today. Emperor Costanza is still praised as a national hero even almost a decade after his death. Costanza is a symbol of unity for the Great Realm, as generally he's seen as its saviour, as well he's propagandized to be. And so you will still see the image of Costanza and Alvasta widely shown throughout the Great Realm. An aspect of the Great Realm that might be important to understand is its culture. So the Great Realm is dominated by the Jantines. There are countless races and species of humans within the Great Realm. The Jantines are the most populous one. They are a race of very pale-skinned people, and will usually have pale hair colours, either such as white or pale green, though it is not unheard of that a Jantine may have black hair, though more often than not it will tend to be a grey colour. The Jantines dominate the Great Realm as its most populous race. The official language of the Great Realm is Jantine, of which there are two variants, the first being sophisticated and the second being simplified, where the upper classes will usually speak the sophisticated variation of Jantine, the lower classes tend to speak the simplified version. And this is where you get the phrase ill-spoken. In Jantine culture, calling someone ill-spoken just means calling them a commoner. I do have a writing system for Jantine, which I'll show on the screen here, see if you can wrap your head around that. There are even laws surrounding the language where in order to get permits for space travel, you do have to prove that you can speak Jantine. If you go into the military, they also will give you courses on how to speak Jantine if you don't already. The Jantines also have an extremely aristocratic culture, which has obviously had a great hand in shaping the Great Realm. Of course, the Emperor himself is also Jantine, he is the Jantine Emperor. The Jantines also have a huge warrior culture. Of course, this is propagated by the regime in order to fuel its armies, but the Jantines are a brutal people who make the ability to kill a point of pride. In most militaries of the Great Realm, even during training they will get prisoners or prisoners of war and have their recruits murder them in various ways. This is of course to properly train them to be killers. The warrior culture is also deeply ingrained into religion. Hymos is the most common religion in the Great Realm and it comes from the Jantines. The Dakar are one of the most famous Hymenisian groups, also known as the warrior priests of Janus. They believe that the Emperor is a divine spirit sent by the gods to guide humanity. But even outside of the Dakar, Hymos is actually pretty common in a lot of the militaries. Especially a lot of their rituals, Hymenisian rituals, will include things such as like bloodletting, where prisoners of war or the warriors will be taken and all of their blood drained, in which it can be used to wash the weaponry and armour of the soldiers, as they believe that the spirit of that warrior will guide them in their next battle. Though I think the religion of Hymos deserves a video in of itself. There are very many religions within the Great Realm, and of course many of the ones that are more powerful are only powerful because they're useful to the regime in some way. Though of course mankind's greatest god is money. As you could imagine, as big as the Great Realm is, it has an extremely complicated economic system. Effectively, the economy is in the hands of each regional government, meaning they can do with it as they wish, which really diversifies how well the Great Realm's economy actually does. Some areas of the galaxy may be having a boom, but others may be on an economic downturn. Generally speaking, as long as businesses conform to the regime's ideology, the Great Realm doesn't really care. Businesses are usually dominated by the regime rather than actually being controlled by them. However, there are limitations to this, as there are always three sectors to an economy. There's the primary sector, which is the extraction of raw resources, the secondary, which is manufacturing, and the tertiary, which is sales and distribution. The secondary and tertiary sectors of the Great Realm's economy are always free market, however the primary sector is under direct state control. Effectively, the government controls the mining of raw resources. Things like mining companies will always be under the direct control of the state government, and all their funds will go to funding the regime. The reason for this is simple: it's one of the most lucrative businesses, and so the regime uses it for the majority of its funding, meaning that most of the Great Realm citizens don't actually get taxed. Most of the Great Realm is completely tax-free, as it doesn't need them, it just has mining companies to make its money for it. Any taxes that do occur in the Great Realm will always be going to the regional government. And of course, as many regions are controlled by family houses, this means the government itself can be used like a business. Many family houses get rich off of selling their population's labour onto various companies, which is where you get the giant factory worlds. But we will discuss those more when I get onto the social caste system. The Great Realm isn't a particularly free state. Free speech simply means a free ticket to an internment camp. The politics of the Great Realm will change from region to region. It will entirely be pretty much whatever that regional government desires. However, the one thing that always trumps the regional government is the central government. The Great Realm's central government wields power over all of the Great Realm to do whatever it wants, and do whatever it wants it does. The Great Realm's methods of ensuring that nobody challenges it are extremely cruel. Of course, this all depends on who exactly is challenging it. If you're a regular person who speaks out against the regime or your living conditions, then most likely you're just going to be either arrested or harassed by civil enforcement, depending on how over the line you step. The The Great Realm doesn't really have to worry about much of its lower classes as they're already pretty well suppressed, and so usually being bullied by civil enforcement is a good enough way to keep them from getting too rowdy. However, as you go up the social ladder, the methods by which the Great Realm uses to control and subdue you become increasingly more terrifying. The primary tool at the Great Realm's disposal is the Internal Security Assembly, also commonly referred to as the ISA. The ISA act as the Great Realm's secret police with agents everywhere. Their primary directive is to keep tabs on everyone with political power within the regime. The head of the ISA will even have a seat on the Central Committee, who are the most powerful ministers in the Great Realm and the direct advisors to the Emperor. And aside from acting as an intelligence service, they can also act as assassins, bodyguards to regime officials, or even an actual military force. And they are of course the regime's primary method of defending itself. They will kidnap, torture, anything they see fit in order to achieve any means, and will most commonly be the guys to carry out executions of the regime's enemies. Very few are actually safe from their grasp. Really only the Drakal royal family are exempt from any ISA interference. But the ISA, the Great Realm's method of terror. There are of course many other methods the regime will actually use in order to subdue a population. The State Department of Public Affairs is one of these organisations. They don't engage in terror, rather they engage in propaganda. They're in charge of curating what is shown to the public and will usually act as the regime's propaganda wing. Any regime propaganda is most certainly created and distributed by these guys. They are effectively in charge of the public appearance of the Great Realm, and they can also of course be used as a weapon. Since they effectively control what people think, they can also control how you feel about a person. It would not be hard for the SDPA to actually mark someone out as an enemy of the state, and thereby a public enemy, someone you should dislike. This tactic was used a lot during the Costanzarite era against governors or military officials, in order to give justification in the public eyes to take them out, when in reality most things the SDPA would say were just fabrications, and it was usually that the regime just wanted them replaced. Of course, how are you ever going to subdue a population without crime and punishment? I'm sure you can imagine exactly what crime and punishment is like in the Great Realm, but let's go over it. The first is that there are two categories for crime. There are civil crimes and political crimes. Civil crimes are of course, let's say, if you steal something or if you murder someone. These are the crimes which you do onto the civil population. Civil crimes will change from region to region what is and isn't legal. However, political crimes are always the same throughout the Great Realm. These are crimes against the regime itself. Speaking up against the Great Realm or showing a dislike for its regime is considered a political crime, and is usually referred to as hate speech. Of course, laws like these are very vague and is usually up to civil enforcement of the ISA whether you've actually broken them. What you actually say or even mean by it does not matter. What matters is how the ISA interpret it. Political freedoms mean you're free to do as you're told. Let's say you're convicted of a crime, well, what's going to happen to you? If you're convicted of a small crime such as just petty theft or assault, then you may just be in jail for a couple months, simply in your holding cell until you're let out. You may get, beaten up by the guards. Of course, even for small crimes, prison systems are still rather rough. But what happens if you're arrested for either a serious or political crime? Well, let's first discuss the actual process. If you're arrested and held within ISA or civil enforcement custody, you basically just want to tell them what they want to hear. It is worth noting that they have complete power over you. There are no checks and balances, and your life is meaningless to them. All that matters is what they can get out of you. And whether you did the crime doesn't matter, it's whether they think you did the crime. Especially if it's the ISA and you're being caught under political crime, the best you can do is give them dirt on someone else, at which they may treat you nicer as you've acted as an informant to them. Though in ISA custody it's always a losing battle. Now if you're convicted and you're lucky, they may just think you're not worth the time and put a bullet in the back of your head. If you're unlucky, then you're going to end up in an internment camp. Internment camps are the regime's primary method of punishing prisoners. They are usually facilities built on extremely hostile worlds where maybe the air is acidic, or it's a frozen wasteland that you couldn't live without specialised equipment, or even built in into asteroids and space. They are usually very expansive but also highly cramped facilities, and they tend to be built as part of mining facilities in order to extract raw resources, and this is where the Great Realm having complete control over the primary sector of the economy comes in handy, as all of its workers are usually slave labour from internment camps. Of course, don't get me wrong, the Great Realm will also work with paid workers, especially if they're going outside of the borders of the Great Realm, but the vast majority of the regime's labour does come from these camps. This does cause the problem where internal security may begin sending people to camps on trumped up charges just to meet quotas, though this is how the regime operates. And of course the labour in such camps are very difficult. Usually prisoners will be forced to work until their fingers begin bleeding, and even then they get no rest. Many prisoners die of exhaustion within the first couple months. Treatment by the guards is not very good either. Prisoners are regularly beaten, starved and tortured. Malnutrition rates are extremely high, and cannibalising dead or dying prisoners is a common occurrence. Many prisoners are sentenced to years in these camps. 15 years is your average sentence to an internment camp. Of course, very few actually survive that, with only 40% of prisoners actually making it past the first 5 years. Many of these camps even have a mortality rate of 97%. And these camps intake hundreds of prisoners, which means that out of every 1,000 prisoners, only 30 can actually be predicted to survive. As camp guards are paid to intake prisoners, many of them will literally just take in more prisoners than they actually have room for. If a camp gets too full, then prison guards might see fit to take certain prisoners and just chain them to poles and let them starve to death. Or even in some extreme cases, entirely taking in new prisoners just to cannibalise them and feed them to the rest of the prison population. Of course, I'm sure many of my viewers are very well versed on cannibalism, and so you may already know that human meat doesn't actually have very much nutritional value, meaning that the cannibalisation of other prisoners doesn't actually do very much to satiate the malnutrition problem. Camps will always end up developing their own social cultures or social hierarchies, and of course they are very rough places, though while the actual nature of these camps is kept away from the general public, there is still an implicit understanding of what they are. And the very idea of being sent to one of these camps is of course a very good method of getting the population to do what you want. I understand that you may feel some sort of sympathy for people in such difficult positions, and of course even the Emperor himself feels such heartbreak that such a thing must happen. Do bear in mind that these are criminals and they are simply repaying their debt to society. Of course, enemies of the state are enemies of the people. There are several of the more brutal methods the regime will use. For example, if the regime is having a quarrel with, let's say, an entire family house or one of the planetary governments, then it may conduct a planetary extermination where the Imperial Navy will just wipe out the planet. Though this is a rare occurrence, but as rare it is, it's still good enough to make Imperial governors not question the regime's authority. Though one of its best methods of social repression is the caste system. The Great Realm is split into several social stratas. This is how power and wealth is divided, and will go from it top to bottom. The first is the aristocracy. These are ruling family houses, and are the most powerful and wealthy people in the regime. The aristocracy usually comprise the most powerful and wealthy family houses. Underneath that you then have the elites, and in the elite social class there are many different kinds. First off you have the bureaucrats, and these are most of the government officials. Bureaucrats are ministers or people who work for the regime, and bureaucrats are usually just considered a less prestigious form of aristocrats. You then of course have military elites. These are top ranking military officials such as generals or admirals. You then have the technocrats. These are people who control most of the businesses in the Great Realm, and will usually have a monopoly on the Great Realm's production and distribution of technology. Then you have the theocrats, who are religious leaders, though some religions become integrated with technology. But underneath the elites you have the middle class, and these are people who aren't particularly powerful but do well off for themselves. So basically wealthy workers, the kinds of people you would see doing spreadsheets. And then of course you have commoners. Commoners are just the average people who will work your regular jobs and just live ordinary lives, as ordinary as things within the Great Realm can be. Of course life isn't particularly easy in the Great Realm. Poverty is commonplace and your life is still in the hands of those above you. But even lower than a commoner would be a dreg. The dregs make up the vast majority of the Great Realm's population, and they are usually where the criminal underworlds will operate. Both dregs and commoners tend to be crammed into these giant factory cities the size of continents, where the factories will produce, well, practically anything. More often than not though, it'll be weapons for the Great Realm's war efforts, usually producing tanks or parts for Imperial starships. Generally speaking, life in these factory cities is terrible. You will usually be born in these cities never seeing the light of sun in your life, as you'll be down in some deep dark part of the factory. From a young age you'll be put to work on these machines, and since you'll be constantly breathing in the toxic fumes from these factories, you're most likely going to die of some sort of horrible disease at 40, while most of you and your family will live together in a single cramped metal box. This is not reflective of all worlds of the Great Realm, but the vast majority of its population does live there simply because of how densely packed these cities are. There are also various commerce and agricultural worlds that aren't too bad, but it is still a higher chance that you'd be born into a factory world than any other. This social caste system helps to repress the lower populations, as there is a sense of hopelessness and not much that they can actually do, meaning that the Great Realm only needs to focus on repressing the upper classes. So there isn't all that much social repression in the lower social stratas. Of course, they usually just get bullied by civil enforcement instead. But another way that the social caste system is used to repress the population is that those who agitate the regime may be lowered. People from higher classes can have their positions stripped of them and move to the lower social stratas, which, as you could imagine, for them is a nightmare, and the fear of losing what you have is a very good way of keeping people in line. However, not everything is simply doom and gloom and terrible. A regime like this wouldn't be able to survive if that was it. One thing we need to look at is the Great Realm's ideology, which is primarily around the unification of humanity. One thing the Great Realm does, and it does well, is provide safety. While it is extremely harsh in its criminal justice system, it does also mean that criminals are very thoroughly prosecuted. So anyone who is actually a criminal that you would hate, like a murderer or a rapist, are still heavily prosecuted by the regime, meaning that it is actually relatively free of crime. Meaning that if you're, let's say, middle class, you actually may have a pretty decent life. As long as you're not a political person, you have the safety and freedom to develop your own life, create your own businesses. And this isn't even to mention the defense of humanity as a whole. There are many very dangerous creatures in the galaxy. Horrific monsters such as the Zenthai who would very quickly genocide the entire human race. The Great Realm is effectively the greatest bulwark against any threats humanity may face, and they do the things they do not simply because they want to do it, but because they have to. The Great Realm needs to be a stable government. If there is any fault or any chinks in its armour, then it is only a way for its enemies to get through, break it up and destroy it. The Great Realm has suffered a lot through its long history, and it is very well aware of the fact that if the Great Realm fails, this could endanger all of humanity. It is the reason the leadership of the Great Realm consider the most dangerous enemy to be from within. If the Great Realm stands united, then its enemies will not be able to overcome it, but should it become unstable and fail, then it will very quickly be destroyed. This is why the central government of the Great Realm could never be a democracy. As it is too volatile a government, it shifts and changes too much. Everyone has to be on board with the same idea, otherwise the regime fails, and if the regime fails, this could mean the death of humanity. Which is where the Great Realm gets its justification from. Which is where we get into the modern state of the Great Realm, because this is how volatile its civil war is. Prince Leo Yeneth believes that the Great Realm is only causing the slow death of humanity, and that it must be destroyed and reorganized if humanity is to be saved, while those of the Great Realm believe that the Great Realm's destruction will be the death of humanity. Of course, on both sides there are individual people in the civil war who are using it for their own gain, but generally speaking at the root of it, both sides believe that they are trying to save humankind. Of course, the main problem with the Great Realm right now is that it has no stability. The Great Realm finds itself in a very sticky situation as the Prince Regent Varstein was killed at the Battle of Vajul. The snake now has no head. there is no leader to take its helm. And as I explained deeper in my video about the history of Avraxis, there is a monarchy crisis, where many in the imperial government are effectively somewhat fighting over who's actually going to become the next ruler of the Great Realm, as all of Emperor Varstein's children, and of course his sister, have all very different qualities. And they are very different people, and so the volatile politics of the Great Realm means that they're very concerned over who's actually going to become the next leader. I explain it more in my summary for the history of Avraxis, but to sum it up as simply as possible, Leo Yeneth's rebellion is actively stopping them from being able to pick a new leader, as their concern is that if they have a new leader, then, well, the rebellion may only deepen, the civil war may only expand, as factions within the Great Realm form and begin physically fighting over who they want to be the next leader. It certainly is a very volatile situation, as the Great Realm central government is having difficulty trying to pick up the pieces of what's happened. Many regions are left to fight for themselves, which at least shows the usefulness in Alvasta's designing of the Great Realm, that militaries can operate without the necessary input from the central government. Of course, how this Great Realm will advance in the civil war is a question that only time will tell, and shall the regime stand for 10,000 more years. Though that'll be it for this video. I hope to catch you in many of the other videos that I've made for Locus to explain in more depth of the aspects of the universe. I hope to see you next time, and thank you for watching.